I would like to welcome Amanda Morris D'Agostino and Colleen Lutz Clemens, and I got a little intro here for you. Sorry. Did I say it right?
Yeah, well, because I wrote down, but when you email it down, nobody pronounces Lutz, right?
They do Lutz, but it's Lutz, right? Very good. Very good. So is it Stoltzfus instead of Stoltzfus? Okay. Colleen Lutz Clemens, PhD, Associate Professor of Non-Western Literatures and Director of Women's and Gender Studies at Kutztown University in Pennsylvania, earned her PhD in Post-Colonial Literature at Lehigh University. Her dissertation focuses on issues of veiling in literature and studies the intersection of women's issues in art and politics. Amanda Morris D'Agostino, PhD, is a member of the KU English Department's CRLS team, and that stands for?
Composition, rhetoric, and... I don't know.
She doesn't even know.
I'm part of the composition rhetoric team. So
That's the important part, composition and rhetoric. And she teaches courses in composition and rhetoric. Her research interests include contemporary indigenous rhetoric, specifically Native American rhetorics, creativity in the classroom, and the power of stories. That's so very, very awesome. Colleen and Amanda co-host the podcast Inside 254, where they share conversations they have when they close the door of their office, 254 Lytle Hall, at Kutztown University, where they love to talk shop in a fun and approachable way. And I'm sure today's program is going to be fun and approachable, or you will get your money back. I guarantee it. All right, so please welcome them to the stage.
This is... Where's the other microphone? Uh-oh.
Right here.
The microphone wanted a bagel.
Thank you.
Okay, before I introduce us, which actually Jason already did, I want to ask you to, that card that I gave you, get a pen, and Paula was kind enough. Does anybody need a pen? Who needs a pen? He needs a pen. And I want you to write, don't think too hard, just off the top of your head. I want you to write what words come to mind when you hear the phrase toxic masculinity. Right.
You'll
now.
never have to share it. We'll see it.
Yeah. It's anonymous. I'm going to collect them,
honest.
but you will not be identified. So write really, truly, honestly, because the goal today is to have a real good, honest conversation. So we need to know what you really think when you hear these words. Off the top of your head. And whatever it is, no judgment.
We've heard worse.
We've heard much worse. So don't even worry about it. They're being very good students. They're writing. We love that. We ask our students to do something, and then they do it. We're like, oh, my God. That's tremendous. You guys are great. Everybody done? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, that's why I gave you a small card, because I figure some of you probably have a lot to say, which is great. But let's limit it, because, we only have an hour and a half. No? Good? Okay, everybody good? All right, I am going to ask my esteemed colleague here to move aside for a minute, because we want to show you a clip, and I'm going to collect these cards from you when it's over. So can I have your attention to the screen, please? It's only 3 minutes.
Stop crying.
Stop with the tears.
Don't cry. Pick yourself up.
Stop with the emotion.
Don't be a pussy.
Don't let nobody disrespect you.
Be cool and be kind of a dick.
Always keep your mouth
Nobody
shut.
likes a tattletale.
Bros come before hoes.
Don't let your woman run your
You
life.
a bitch.
What a fag. Get laid. Do something.
Be a man.
Be a man.
Grow some balls.
The three most destructive words that every man receives when he's a boy is when he's told to be a man.
We've constructed an idea of masculinity in the United States that doesn't give young boys a way to feel secure in their masculinity, so we make them go prove it all the time.
Within their peer group culture, each of them is posturing based on how the other boys are posturing, and what they end up missing is what they each really want, which is just that closeness.
In good times, guys are like really close to each other, but when things get a little bit worse, you're on your own.
From middle school, I had 4 really close friends. Once I kind of went into high school, I struggle finding people I can talk to because I feel like I'm not supposed to get help.
Our kids get up every morning. They have to prepare their mask for how they're gonna walk to school. A lot of our students don't know how to take the mask off. What is it you don't let people see? Almost 90% of you have pain and anger on the back of that paper.
If you never cry, then you have all these feelings stuffed up inside of you, and then you can't get them out.
They really buy into a culture that doesn't value what we've feminized. If we're in a culture that doesn't value caring, doesn't value relationships, doesn't value empathy, you are going to have boys and girls, men and women go crazy.
Hello.
It's no big deal. No, you got my point. Okay, I'm sorry. My fault. That was my bad.
Okay, so, thank you. Do I have everybody's cards? Yeah? Okay. All right, here. Just hang on to those for a second. Okay. All right, so thank you very much for participating in the writing portion of our presentation. We do believe in some interaction. We don't really like Sage on the stage, and yet here we are. Sage is on the stage. Go figure. Thank you for your attention to that documentary clip. I believe my friend and colleague would probably recommend that you watch that documentary, yes?
So that is from a clip from a film called The Mask You Live In, which was done all about masculinity. It is on Netflix, and you can watch it. But I think just even that little bit gives you a taste of what it might present and do a deep dive into how we talk about masculinity.
And it is still available on Netflix, yeah?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So, you can go home, keep hiding from the heat this afternoon, and watch that documentary. Okay.
You won't need to after us.
Right. You'll be good.
Fine.
Okay, so let's start with a basic definition. What is toxic masculinity? Because we hear this word bandied about a lot. And let me just preface this entire presentation by saying, unfortunately, we are very well aware that the concept of toxic masculinity, that phrase, has a lot of controversy attached to it. There's a lot of discord out there on the interwebs. There's a lot of anger from certain quarters. There's a lot of defensiveness. And I think there's also a lot of confusion over what it is and what it isn't. So I just want to let you know, again, we're here in a role as educators. We are educators. We are professors. We're here to teach you something. We're not here to judge you, and we're not here to attack you. So if you start feeling, because I think a lot of the phrase toxic masculinity, and when we start talking about it, might raise some emotions. You might start having the feels, whatever that is, anger, upset, hopefully not joy. But you're going to have feelings. I would just ask you to breathe through it, sit with those feelings, and then when we get to the next interactive portion of our presentation, we can certainly have a discussion, because we want to talk to you guys and maybe clear some things up, help you understand. So I just wanted you to know we're aware this might cause. Just breathe through it. Okay. With that said, tell us.
So we're going to do this as a conversation.
Yeah.
That's our plan.
So, my friend, what is toxic masculinity? If you were going to tell us a basic definition of what toxic masculinity is, what would that be?
Toxic masculinity is a brand of masculinity, and we need to go a step back really quickly and talk about the difference between gender and sex. Because very quickly, when people hear the phrase toxic masculinity, people think you're saying men are bad. So masculinity is gender. Sex is biology. This is super reductive, but it's Sunday. So when we're talking about toxic masculinity, we're talking about gender constructs, which we'll get to in a second, not biology, not sex. So very quickly, like when Tucker Carlson is yelling about me on his show on Fox, he is saying that I say I hate men. And actually, I think when people are wanting to be here on a Sunday morning having a conversation about toxic masculinity, it is because of a deep love for humanity. and a deep love for trying to figure out what is not working in this particular brand of masculinity. So we're going to talk a little bit soon about gender constructs and what that means, but toxic masculinity is one way of wearing the mask, like in that, of masculinity. It's not the only way, right? The word toxic is in front of it. It's not just all masculinity. So let's just be super clear. And if you don't buy into the idea that sex and gender are different, this is going to be a really long hour for you. But that to me is that's non-negotiable. So in order to have this conversation, at least for an hour, you need to come on board and understand the difference between sex and gender.
Okay, so now that we've got the basics, what is toxic masculinity? So toxic masculinity is a type of mask, right? It's a type of masculinity. So it's not the only type of masculinity. But what type is it? Could you maybe give us an example?
All right. So toxic masculinity would be the idea that there's only one way to be a man. You heard them bring that up, that the 3 worst words you can say to a boy as they grow up is be a man. And you heard a bunch of other variations of that in the clip as well. So the idea that there's only one way to be a man in this country, because gender constructs change throughout cultures, the only one way to be a man is to not show emotion, to think that you must be heterosexual, to think that if you do have emotion, you should be ashamed of it, right? So that's a deep-seated shame that you cannot express or share. Because if you do express or share that, you are a pussy or a fag or any other derogatory word that we hear bandied about a lot. Or at least you're not a man, right? You're not a man. So the toxicness of this gender construct of masculinity, again, one brand of masculinity, not all, because can you tell I've been willfully misunderstood throughout my career?
And it's worth repeating.
So, right, that one brand of masculinity, and that there are consequences to this. That the toxicity is not just to the person who feels those things, but that often that toxicity is then manifested in action toward women, toward strangers, that manifestation of the feeling that you are not enough then becomes almost like an aggrieved belief that you are owed something. So at some point by the end of this talk, we'll talk about how toxic masculinity may have connections to men acting badly. And again, because of a construct, not because men act badly because of their sign. I always say, like, a penis doesn't make you a bad person, right? It doesn't, and that is said out of kindness, right? Because if we want to believe there's this rigidity about sex, not gender, then there's no space for change. And we just all need to throw up our hands and say, boys will be boys, which we'll talk about in a second. And then we all shrug and we move on. And we don't have conversations about how we can change things for the good, first of all, of those boys, and then also for the rest of us that may be affected by that type of masculinity.
Yeah, that's good. So, you mentioned this, but is the phrase toxic masculinity an attack on all men? Because when my friend here was attacked on Twitter for actually tweeting in November, toxic masculinity is killing all of us, everyone, killing us all. And she repeated it 3 times. And the far right picked up on that, and they started attacking her. That's how Tucker Carlson ended up knowing who she was and attacking her on his show. And so the idea that toxic masculinity, but I think what a lot of people hear, and I say people because I don't know, it could be men, it could be women, because there were men and women and whoever else attacking you, is the phrase toxic masculinity the same as attacking men, for just men are bad, right? So that's a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, bears repeating. And is that a phrase that's the same as an attack on all men? Like, men are bad?
No.
Just not to put a too fine point on it.
I'm married to a man, not
so
that legitimizes anything.
No.
I'm fully capable of being in a room full of men and liking them.
Right.
But again, if I circle back to, this is done out of a concern for men.
Yeah.
That this, so the common
limiting.
thing
It's limiting,
here's the thing.
right?
Common thing I hear about is, what about toxic femininity?
Yeah.
So I actually believe there is such a thing as toxic femininity.
Yes.
And as feminists, we worked through that shit in the 90s.
Right.
And toxic femininity, things like eating disorders or the beauty myth, or those are often enacted on a woman's body on their own.
The internalized.
So it's not that am I not allowed to curse? Oh, okay. You want me to mention TERFs? Oh, no, yeah. That's another talk. Maybe I'll come back and okay. So toxic femininity is a thing, but we just tried to figure it out in the 90s. And we in the feminist community did a decent job of that. Not that things are all better, but I think you have seen an expanded idea of what girls can be, thanks to first and second and third wave feminism. Girls can be more than one path. But now, feminist scholars, we're like, okay, so how do we open up those spaces for boys too? Because this, feminism isn't just about women. It's about everyone. It's about equity for everyone. So how do we open up this space now? So I think toxic femininity is absolutely a thing, but I feel like that's been done. Like, we did it. We did it in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the aughts. Like, we have beaten that. Everybody knows at this point that there are oppressive ideas about femininity. We did a great job. And now I feel like we're kind of at the beginning of another conversation that is, how do we bring boy children along too and not force them into a limiting role? Even if that limiting role meant access to more power, for example, how do we take away the shame of a boy maybe feeling like he has to be one specific thing? So, did I answer that?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Okay, so that's good. So now, okay, don't run away. We wanted to pull some biblical quotes. Y'all are humanists, so there is a reason why we're pulling biblical quotes. So take a breath, and Colleen, you want to talk about these biblical quotes?
We were invited here to talk about why this might be an issue to you as an audience, and we are rhetoricians, right? We believe knowing your audience is important.
Language matters.
So this is, right, so we wanted to pull some quotes that might be about the rigidity of gender roles. And again, it is a dangerous game to cherry pick from any book. So I'm not going to be flip. And I purposely didn't pick any from the Quran because I feel like we have dragged that book through the mud enough, and I'm not going to do anything to have facilitate that reification of everybody's belief that the Quran is filled with sexism. I'm not going to participate. I'm happy to participate that with the Bible because it doesn't seem to have that marginalization. So can you read them?
Yeah, I'll read them. Shoulder. So sorry, camera people. Okay. So the first one is from 1 Timothy 2:12, and the quote is, "But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence." The second one is Ephesians 5:22-33. "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord." The third is 1 Corinthians 14:34-35. "Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law." And the final quote we pulled, Ephesians 5:23, "For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body."
So we picked those to talk about how gender roles are super inscribed in the ways we move through the world. That this would be an example, frankly, this is an example of toxic femininity, right? That women are only to do one thing. But we wanted to talk about how the belief that there is only one natural way to be a woman, or that there's only one natural, and that'll be an important word in a second, way to be a man. And that if you push against it at all, in this context of religion, if you push against it at all, you are a heretic. You are not following God's word, right? So this is one inscribed, prescriptive, narrow path that many people, right, believe in. So this would be an example of that rigid one-line way to be a woman, in this case to be a wife for the most part.
And it's super relevant, but not only to today, to this group, but also just to our culture in America. We hear a lot about how we are, founded in Judeo-Christian beliefs. Well, there you go, right? So it's almost like our culture, with that foundation in Judeo-Christian beliefs, is suggesting that this is the attitude that should hold sway, and it feeds into that. So it's a whole, like, nothing exists in a vacuum. Nothing exists in a vacuum. You hear us, it sounds like we're going on tangents, but we're not. It's all these things are connected and related, and you almost can't have this conversation without at least bringing in some of those foundational beliefs that we as Americans are supposed to be holding to. This is one of them, right? So we're not just fighting against, biblical beliefs. We're fighting against the foundations of what some people say that our country is founded on. These kinds of beliefs. It's a big hill to climb, right?
Yeah, and this is just one example. We're going to show you some other examples, but since you're humanists, we wanted to make sure we brought in how religion can often prescribe this as well and be really problematic, and how it might contribute to the conversations and the responses that people have. I understand if somebody believes that man was made in the image of God or something like that. I understand why they would be upset when I start to bring up the idea of masculinity. Because now I'm questioning not just an idea, but I'm questioning a deep-seated belief. So these are not easy waters to tread in, I think is what we wanted you to realize that as we talk about this.
So thank you for treading water with us. Moving on. I'm going to ask my friend, she is a feminist scholar, so she has done a lot of writing and thinking and studying about this. She writes about it herself. And I wanted you to give us sort of a basic walkthrough. Like, don't beat us over the head with the academic language. I know you won't, because we pride ourselves on being public intellectuals, making it accessible to people. So you can tell us later if we succeeded. But a couple theories of gender. One is biological essentialism, and which you kind of touched on a little bit. And then the other one is social constructionism. So can you walk us through the idea of biological essentialism? And just so you know, the examples that I have up here are quotes that you might hear a lot that sort of suggest biological essentialism. When you hear these things, that means whoever's saying them is basically a biological essentialist. Boys will be boys. That's just locker room talk. He does that because he likes you, right? That's biological essentialism. But friend, can you explain to us what that really is?
So we are always trying to have better understanding of how we move through the world in these gendered bodies. And biological essentialism was much more popular in like the 70s, where the idea that your biology determines your gender, in the sense of, if you think about it, like women are naturally more peaceful. I don't believe any of this, but women are naturally more peaceful. If the world were ruled by women, there would be no wars. That's biological essentialism. The idea that women are somehow biologically essentially different than men, which they're not, except for their biology, their parts, and that boys are biologically essentially geared toward violence, which I also don't think is true. So biological essentialism believes that your biology determines how you move through this world. And that is the only way you should move through this world. And if you veer from moving through the world that way, you are abnormal, something is wrong with you, and you are, to quote The Handmaid's Tale, a gender traitor, right? That's what they would call it in Gilead. So let's talk about these three phrases. Boys will be boys. So when somebody says that to me, first of all, try not to have my head explode. Second of all, what I do is say, no, I actually think boys can be better than this. Because when you hear that, it's being used as an excuse for a boy doing something that's poor behavior. That's the only time you hear that. When a mother of a little boy and her little boy knocks over my daughter on a playground says to me, boys will be boys. No. Boys can be better than that. So that phrase is super popular. You'll start to notice it now when people say that. Or if you think about, they're called gender reveal parties, but they're not really gender reveal parties. They're sex reveal parties. Do you know what these are? Where people like cut a cake and it's pink, or put blue balloons in a box, right? Those folks are sometimes they're like, the invitations will be like pearls or pistols, right? Pearls, girls are soft. Pistols, boys are hard. Go Google gender.
Google it.
Yeah, I mean, gender reveal invites, they're sex reveal parties, but you have to Google gender reveal. They are very telling about how we are very committed in our culture to biological essentialism. Saying something is locker room talk, which is just the equivalent of saying boys will be boys, except they're older now and they can be in a locker room. That locker room talk is somehow naturally boys are innately going to dismiss girls.
Can I interject? That was the favorite defense of our current president when, during the presidential campaign, the video came out with him on a bus with Billy Bush, and he was having a private conversation that he did not know was being recorded, and he talked about, I don't know if I could say this, I'm looking at Jason, and he was talking about, grab women by the pussy because he can, it's great. And his defenders, I believe both men and women.
I was on a TV show where a man directly said this to me, so go ahead.
Yeah, and this is the thing, I don't want to say it wasn't just men, it was women defending him too. Like less than half the country voted for him, but still, there were a lot of women who voted for him, and there were men and women saying, well, that's just locker room talk, no big deal.
So anyway, that's biological essentialism.
That's normalizing it.
Because that means what we're saying is, to me, all of these things are insulting to boys. I'm not sitting here on a Sunday morning talking to you about this because I have some deep-seated hatred of masculinity. I'm talking to you about this because I think that this is a deep-seated hatred of boys, that we allow them so little and give them so little credit.
We put them in a box, and we say, you're only allowed to be this one thing, and this is who you are. We're like defining them. This is who you are. This is who you are. You are the bad behavior. You are the locker room talk. You are all these things. I mean, I can't imagine being a boy, because I'm not a boy, but imagine being a boy and having that be the message. That's all you are. And thinking, what if I want to do something else? And our culture doesn't allow it, because toxic masculinity. Thank you.
And the last one, he does that because he likes you. That's, what I was told walking down the hall when a boy would snap my bra or harass me.
Or
he
be
does
mean
that,
to me.
Right. Or he does that because he likes you. Well, that's an example of no, he was taught that. He was taught that this is the way you teach women or talk to women or treat women. That a penis does not automatically make you a harasser. It does not automatically make you say terrible things about women. Right? Biological essentialism is not. It's not manifest destiny of a boy's humanity. So, what I and most feminist scholars ascribe to now is that gender is a social construction. That mostly, other than biological parts, when kids come out, they're pretty much the same. And that from before they were born, however, through gender reveal parties or that they have already had gender inscribed upon them. So I was pregnant once and was asked a lot of times what I was having. And my answer was always, I'm having a feminist.
I love that answer.
And they were like, oh, then you're having a girl. I'm like, well, no, okay. But people get really upset when you don't tell them what you're having. And the reason I did that is because I didn't want to construct my daughter. I knew she was a girl, just didn't need to tell anybody that. I knew she was sexed a girl. That doesn't mean I knew what her gender was. Again, this line. So I don't know. I mean, I think her gender is girl now. I mean, she's 6, so I have a sense, and I've tried really hard not to socially construct her gender for her. But I always tell my students I didn't tell anybody I was having a girl because I didn't want the tide of pink wave at the shower. Because the moment you tell somebody the sex of a child, immediately they want to buy stuff. And the answer I got all the time was, well, it's not fair, How do I know what to buy for you? Now
because it's all about them, not about you.
But just think about that for a second. Just think about the need our culture has to gender this tiny little thing that really just thinks about eating, sleeping, and pooping for a good 6 months. Just think about our the anxiety that was caused by me withholding information. So the reason I did that is because I think that gender is socially constructed and that we need to allow children, boy children as well, an opportunity to really look around and see how they feel. That gender roles and gender identity are something that is put upon us, that is not necessarily always innate. So you'll hear if somebody's trans. And all that means is, the line from sex to gender isn't a straight line, cis. It just goes across, right? That's where that language comes from, trans. The line from sex to gender. I line up. I'm cisgender. What that means is my biological sex and my gender line up, cis line. If somebody's trans, it just goes across, right? The word has become so loaded. But you'll hear somebody who's trans and they'll talk about this as if they were hiding who they were for years. Most folks I know who are trans knew by the time they were 5 that they felt not okay in their bodies. But for another 10 years, 20 years, they lived a life that did not allow for their authentic selves. And they lived a life of shame, if we want to circle back to the ideas of toxic masculinity. That they believed there was one way to move through the world, and I have to, God damn it, move through the world in this way, even if it kills me, which happens a lot.
So can you talk
yes.
about the idea of performance in social interactions related to this idea that we, as a culture, construct gender? So the idea of those social interactions, the performance aspect.
So if you caught that in the video, they talked very quickly about being in a locker room in that 3 minutes. In the Mask You Live In, it goes much more deeply into it. But the idea that one kid learns how to front, and then all the other kids learn how to front based on that fronting, and then nobody's actually doing the thing that they actually feel like in their hearts they want to do, because everybody's so busy with the mask and their fronting or their posturing or whatever word you want to use for it. They're enacting gender. They're performing it, to use Judith Butler's word, right? They're performing gender instead of actually being who they are. So,
and how you perform it, does that depend on your relational position to the people around you, to your family, to your
so for example, I have had a bunch of men now they've made it through puberty, tell me that they felt obligated to try to get some, or they felt obligated to talk about girls in ways that didn't make them feel good, but they felt like they had to do that because if they didn't, their masculinity would be questioned. What are you, a pussy? Right? Because the worst thing you can call a boy is a female part. What are you, a fag? And I taught high school for many years. I'm not talking about Saturn here. I'm talking about here. And so the idea of performing in social interactions, when I spent all that time with teenagers, it was very clear to me how much people feel like they have to posture. My daughter said to me the other day, I hate my bangs. Now, she doesn't have bangs. She's 6. And I was like, who taught you? Where did you even learn that? And she watched some stupid YouTube video where there's a bunch of girls, and she heard girls saying, I hate my bangs, and now she thinks that's something she's supposed to say, wow. Right? These little things. My daughter has never heard the word fat in our house. I always joke I'm going to write an article about the time my daughter said the F word. But the F word is fat.
You totally should.
And I was driving, and I almost pulled off the road when she said she was fat. I was like, what? Where are you learning this? Because no girl child comes out of the body of its mother programmed to think it's fat. But somewhere along the way, she learned that. I don't know if it was from a YouTube video. Clearly, I'm not parenting. I don't know.
So it's cultural conditioning.
It's culture. It's cultural conditioning. That gender is cultural. That gender. That there's no man behind the. There's no Oz, right? There's no man behind the curtain saying we're going to do this to women and men. It's just through religious text, through cultural text, It's the way we think about gender. And now it's kind of become the wallpaper in the back of the room and nobody thinks about it. And what we're trying to do is get you to think about it when we say these things.
And question it.
Yeah.
And question it. And don't just assume that that position is the right one. Okay. Would you like to talk a little bit about...
Why don't you introduce the idea of this?
Okay.
And then I'll...
We talk about this a lot on our podcast, and we actually talk a lot about it in the various classes that we both teach. The difference between structural and individual. That actually plays a big, big part in helping people to understand that when you talk about difficult things like toxic masculinity or other issues, that it's not about a personal attack on individuals. And it's also not about well, it can be about individual behavior, but it's within the context of a larger structure, right? So our culture is a structure, right? So we have these structures in place. Masculinity as a concept is a structure, right? And it's not about the individuals. Like each of you is an individual, but we are all part of a larger structure that we live in called America, right? Want to add anything to that?
Sure. Okay, so the reason that we think this was an important thing that we wanted to talk about today is because people who immediately kind of draw inward to themselves and get really upset when toxic masculinity is mentioned, I understand that urge if you think it's about you personally. Nobody wants to, it's the same conversation as white privilege, right? Nobody wants to feel bad about who they are. So I understand that inclination. But when we're talking, but when the conversation is happening, it's really talking about much bigger pictures. It's not, I have never pointed at someone and said, you are toxically masculine. No. Like, this is about how do we have conversations in a culture that still privileges, even though spaces are being opened, but that still privileges cisgender, white, heteronormative, capitalist structures. How do we have a conversation? It's true? Is that what you said? Christian. Oh, sorry. Yes. Yeah, I should have added that. Yeah. I kind of did with the Bible.
I know you did.
And Christian, right? So how do we have a conversation about something that doesn't feel good on an individual level?
Right.
We have it on a structural level. Because I sit in front of you with tons of privilege, right?
Yep,
I am white. I have a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
I am cisgender. Mm-hmm. I'm heterosexual. Mm-hmm. I am upper middle class. Like, I'm sitting in front of you.
I'm just seconding everything she says because it applies to me too. I'm very well aware. We're aware
structurally
of our
lots
position.
Of privilege. And also, though, I could be at home with my family right now, right? I want to use that privilege to some good end.
Right.
And push conversations about how we can all be better people. And I think gender has a lot to do with how we be better people.
Right. So when we talk about toxic masculinity as it exists in the world today, one of the things that we talked about on our podcast episode about this issue was what are some, well, there's both the extreme examples that you see it being enacted in the public, but there's also the everyday, regular, daily examples, which I believe boys will be boys, locker room talk. Those kinds of phrases are part of that toxic masculinity structure. But when we see toxic masculinity in the world, be a man, that sort of things. But there are also extreme examples. And the question is, so what kind of man is that? Like when you're saying, okay, so if it is an individual, an example.
So the boogeyman of toxic masculinity is having your masculinity questioned, as if that were a bad thing. That is the basis and the reliance on this toxicity to exist. That's the nugget, right? So to question somebody's manhood, and therefore, by virtue of that, is trying to bring them down a peg, which is counterintuitive to me. When Amanda was talking about the more egregious things, the reason I had tweeted that toxic masculinity is killing us all is because I think all of us are bystanders to this kind of violence. So the hyper example would be incels, men who, incel stands for incelibate, men who will purposely go out and kill women because those women refuse to have sex with it. And these are strangers, right? But just the idea...
Involuntarily celibate.
Right.
Involuntarily celibate.
So the idea
that
that I am owed something, women don't give it to me, and so I'm going to, like in Santa Monica or in Canada, mow down women because all women are the enemy.
And again, not all men who enact toxic masculinity do that. That is a hyper toxic masculine example.
I'm talking about ranges.
Yeah.
So that's like the high range. But what we really want to talk about is that kind of low susurrating range of toxic masculinity that's where I see space for boys, and thereby I think safety for girls and for all of us if we create those spaces for boys. So that's why we have these up here, right? Be a man is like the number one thing. That's to me, like if somebody says that, you are like the toxic masculinity culprit for a second. Like if you are pushing against someone else's masculinity as a way to bring them down,
to insult them,
that's a problem.
Right. Yeah.
So that's an example that you might hear in language, or questioning men. No, it's okay. You can put it up.
Yeah. So we there's this guy who tweets.
So
and you might know him.
Yeah, this is toxic masculinity being enacted. I care who you vote for, but in this moment, I don't. Like, if you just came along for the ride with me for an hour and see the problem with insulting somebody's manhood as a way to try to raise yourself up, then you can at least, I hope, see the problem with these very public texts of our president shaming other men and questioning their manhood.
So I'm going to read for the benefit of those of you who might not be able to read it, and also those who might be watching on YouTube.
And these were in 2018. I didn't go deep into the archive.
No. This was literally like, wow. Okay, so
one was
2 days ago. So let's start with the one that was a little bit earlier. So the one on this side of the screen here. This was from February 12th, 2018 at 6:50 p.m. Donald Trump tweeted, "Shyster Joe Biden wants me to resign because he knows he can't beat me in 2020. What kind of man is that?" ? Biden is missing a few brain cells and a few other things too! ! Hashtag, all caps, keep America great.
So there are all kinds of interesting things happening there. But what I want us to just talk about is the questioning of the manhood. What kind of man is that? To me, that is enacting a problematic brand of masculinity. That means that if you aren't a man, then you are less than. And I think even after this, then Joe Biden was like, I'll get in a fight with you. And then it became this weird, just gross. I think it just became this really gross thing. But it started with this questioning. Now, this one just happened last week, which I thought was fabulous.
Right. So the other one happened on June 24th, 2018. At 8:01 p.m., Donald Trump tweeted, Jimmy Fallon is now whimpering to all that he did the famous, quote, hair show with me, parenthetical, where he seriously messed up my hair, end parentheses, and that he would have now done it differently because it is said to have, quote, humanized me, dash, he is taking heat. He called and said, quote, monster ratings. Be a man, Jimmy, ! Would somebody else like to explain why that's... Yeah, you get it now?
So here's the thing, right? If we're talking about thinking structurally and about where power goes and who has power, to have a president who is willing to emasculate and shame, right, using masculinity as his club, and this is very common, to use the masculinity as the battering ram. This is a problem, right? This is toxic masculinity in action. Aside from the egregious grammatical mistakes of these tweets.
And caps and exclamation points, which I have to reveal. My friend hates those. All caps and exclamation points. Don't use that.
This happens all the time. Be a man. The conversations about hand size and penis size as a way of like browbeating masculinity. Talking about locker room talk as if that's an excuse for talking about sexually assaulting women. Those are insulting to men. Like, I can pretty much move on. I know how to live in my worlds, and not participate in a lot of this. But this is a serious problem. If we're trying to expand the ways that boys can be boys, but then we keep shrinking it back down in such a public forum, I would argue has deep and serious ramifications for us culturally if we're going to move the bar. So these just happened. When this happened this week, because be a man is the quintessential way to know that someone is kind of asserting that hyper masculinity that I would argue is toxic.
To men and everyone else.
To everybody. Right.
To
These
everyone.
These are both
everyone.
insults to other men. Right.
They
This
are.
is not to me. There are
No.
many insulting things that happen.
Yeah, well.
But these are directed to men. That's why I picked these, right? Because this is insulting another man's value because he's no longer a man.
And let's be honest, when you have the President of the United States, a very high-profile, probably the most high-profile person in the world, doing this kind of thing in a public domain for all to see, it sends a message, right? As a rhetorician, language matters. The language that you use, what you say, and the higher your profile, the bigger your platform, the more it matters, because it's sending a message to everybody who's listening, which is, let's be honest, all of us. It's sending a message that be a man is the standard. That is where we want. And what we're trying to do is say, no, no, no. So we need more voices pushing back against this. Okay, so speaking of voices, hold on. So now we're going to actually, and obviously you didn't write your name, so I don't know who wrote what, and it doesn't matter. We don't want to know. So we're going to get to, I asked you guys to write what words came to mind. Yep, when I said, when you hear the words toxic masculinity. So I'm going to give my friend here the option of picking a card. Yeah. Oh, 2 o'clock. Okay.
So these have similar words. They share the word misogyny, which is hatred of women. And I think what you'll notice is maybe we didn't talk about that much for this hour. That we did not focus on this as a violence against women issue, but more as a how do we raise our boys to have better opportunities. Being anti-feminist, weak, pussy, right? So these words I think that we've probably talked about. So that's good, yeah.
That's good. So this is a very smart class. Pick again.
Well, even if you didn't write that, you're still smart.
I know that.
Oh, okay.
So I'm just impressed.
I don't want anybody
I'm
to...
always impressed when my students say something other than Trail of Tears. When I teach about indigenous rhetorics, when someone says, "Oh, I went to a museum and they had these displays of this like modern attire," I'm like, "Yes, that's amazing." We get very excited. Gold star.
So this, okay, again, interesting that this card has the word power on it, right? Because this is all about power, boss power, and I think that would be a really great way to think about this, right? Like boss. I think Donald Trump frames himself that way. That very forceful, like, I know, the dismissiveness of that could be, and that would be, again, toxic masculinity being enacted. Again, this is not a natural thing. This is not, at least I would argue it is not.
Right.
Burying emotions. They didn't need us here today. Ignoring male rape. Oh, I'm so glad somebody wrote that.
Yes, that's
so let me
good
talk
point.
about that for a second. Right? The idea that is toxic masculinity at its finest. The belief that a man cannot be raped or sexually assaulted. And that is why so many men or boys who are sexually assaulted or raped will not bring it up, because it's like an extra added layer now of their masculinity, or perhaps even their sexuality, being questioned. So that's a really, ignoring male rape, that's a really great thing to bring up.
Mm-hmm. Y'all are doing so well. I'm really impressed.
Sexual assault, right?
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
If we want to talk for a minute about rape, right, the first thing that we need to talk about is that rape is about power, not about sex. So if we are willing to all go along with that, if we're talking about power, and if toxic masculinity is teaching boys that they need to assert power, even when somebody doesn't want it asserted upon them, that would be an example of toxic masculinity. Of course, sexual assault, partner violence, incel movements, all of that type of misogynistic violence falls under this umbrella. I think what has happened is that we in the feminist community are trying to find language to get to everybody else to come along with us like they did about girls. I think eventually most people understood that like maybe Barbie's problematic and that maybe the way we talk about our bodies is a problem. Like I think most people are willing at least to go along for the ride with that. And so now this language is in hopes of people having more, and I will tell you right now, people are having way more conversations about this.
And it's showing up in news stories and things, right? You actually see this word, toxic masculinity, being used in news stories when sometimes reporters are talking about something that's happened in the news or something that some high-profile person did or said. And so, I mean, I think definitely the conversation is changing, but I think especially nowadays, a lot of us feel this just devastating level of despair of like, oh my God, there's bad news. It's almost like you always call whack-a-mole. It's just there's something bad happening every day and there's so much. And this is a hard topic. So what can we do about it, right? One of the things on our podcast, we really try to end every episode with an activist action. What is it that we, as individuals in this larger structure, what can we do? So hopefully to end on a little bit of a positive activist note for you, there are things that all of us can do, little small moves. Remember, it's not about the tsunami isn't just going to happen. It's little moves, little small moves that each of us make on an individual level does create the wave of change that we eventually want to see. But it's not going to happen overnight. You just have to accept that, breathe through it, and then make little moves. So these are some of the little moves. One of them is stop saying boys will be boys. Stop saying locker room talk. Stop saying be a man to your friends, your family.
Boys don't cry.
Boys don't cry. Stop
and these are
that.
Instincts like even I have, right?
Yeah.
Like when I'm with my 6-year-old nephew, I feel them come here, but I am able to stop them from coming out my mouth. But even I still have these inclinations
because we're part of this culture.
Things. Right.
We were raised with that language. We were raised with that expectation and understanding. So when we're sitting up here so confidently going, well, just do this, it's not that we don't still fight those urges because it's so embedded in here and in here, but it's worth fighting against, right? And our own language is a great first place to start. Another thing is, if you are comfortable disrupting your own language and kind of coming between the urge and the thing coming out of your mouth, when you hear somebody else say it, and I am not encouraging anybody to go have a conflict or fist fight with somebody. I'm not. I'm saying, when possible, when you feel safe, when you feel like that person might be receptive to the comment, try to respectfully, now that you have some more information, respectfully disrupt that language in a social interaction. Even just say, hey, I don't really think that's... No, I think boys can be more than that.
Yeah, that was exactly the line I was just going to give you.
I'm trying to think, what would you say to locker room talk? No, not all boys talk like that in a locker room. I mean, even something that simple,
I think
right?
it's just shifting that for kids because they don't know. Right? The world, they have the world up until this point, and sometimes we just have to put into their imagination that there is a different way. Again, these small moves. But honestly, if somebody says boys will be boys to me, I always say I think boys can be better than that. That's all I say. I don't launch into some hour-long talk about talk. I just say I think boys can be better than that. And that's enough. That's enough. You don't need to get on your high horse.
I mean, we all love a good rally, right? We all love good protest. But sometimes it's just it's those little daily, small, quiet moves. If we all start doing them, that does create
especially
change.
In the space of parenting.
Well, yeah.
Or grandparenting.
And
or
then
auntying.
Auntying. And then also the discussion with friends. I mean, you're all here. You can talk to each other over lunch about this, but then maybe expand it out to your friend networks that are outside this group. Take it to your book club. Take it to, when you go to lunch with your friends. And that's all of you, men and women. Have you ever heard the phrase toxic masculinity? What do you think when you hear that? And now you know a little bit more, so when you ask your friend that, then they say something that maybe you're like, yeah, that's not, then you can have a conversation. And those conversations are important too. It can change things. because now you're spreading that net out just a little bit and using your network to do it. Another thing that you can do that's actually pretty low-key and low stakes is sharing stories and articles on social media. Those of you who are on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever other things that are out there that I'm not aware of yet, you can follow hashtags and follow scholars who are doing this work, and then sharing stories when you see one, and maybe putting a comment or even just sharing it without comment, and see if people read it and say anything. I mean, that's another way to get some information out there.
Not to plug my own work, but I have 3 really good pieces on teaching tolerance about this that are very much meant for a non-scholarly audience, right? Like, how do we make this a conversation we can all have? Because if it's just happening in academia, there's no point in having the conversation.
Right. It has to grow outside those bounds. And then, obviously, Colleen mentioned, parents of young boys in particular, I don't know if there are any here, but parents of young boys in particular can really disrupt, by making those different choices in how you speak to your young boys. And then I wanted to open it up to the audience, and I'm going to come out here and find out, so what are your ideas to disrupt this kind of idea of toxic masculinity? What are some ideas that you have? Because I really want us all to understand what our options are. So here we go.
Is this on? Yep, it is. Okay. I think having a positive example also can be helpful. And I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with Fred Rogers. My husband and I just saw the new documentary about him called "Won't You Be My Neighbor?" It's in theaters now. And so, I don't know, I don't have kids, but if I were in that position, I might just say, hey, remember how Mr. Rogers was and how he treated people? If I had a boy, I'd love for my boy to grow up like that, and just offer a positive example. So that's just an idea that I had.
That is an incredible idea. Thank you for bringing that up. I haven't seen the movie yet because I feel like I'm going to cry. I grew up with Fred Rogers, right? I was a kid in the 70s, and I think that would be, don't you think? That's a great example. Good job. Hey, yes?
You may see a piece about me seeing that movie and writing about how it disrupts toxic masculinity.
Exactly.
So I'll give you credit.
So as our speakers know, but none of you do, I come from a Native American community. And it's something very common that I did not think about until literally today and listening to Colleen speak, that we don't gender our children in terms of how we speak to them. It's never girls do this, boys do this. It's always, this is how to be a good person. So I think if you can consciously make that choice of saying, good people do this, good people don't do this, and correct behavior without gender. That's what I do with my son. I think he said to me the other day the most strange thing, where I was trying to help him deal with an emotion and basically saying, like, look, if it's not against the rules, then you can do it. Don't listen to other people saying that you suck at a game because you chose something that they didn't do. You chose a strategy that they didn't do. And he goes, God, Mom, you're such a counselor. And I'm like, what does that mean? And it came to me in terms of, like, I'm talking about feelings. And I was really appreciative that he didn't say, you're such a girl or something because I'm talking about feelings. No, I'm a counselor. So I think that's just kind of a way back as
I think that's
what
just Taryn, that's such a safe thing, right? Never start a sentence with girls don't or boys don't, unless you're talking about, like, how to treat others. But yeah, to de-gender it and just person it, just like pronouns, we could do that too.
I think it's also important to make the distinction between impulse and action, because I know, or at least my experiences with young men my age, is that we will all have, or many of us will have, bad impulses, or we will have the urge to be, very aggressive or very asserting or dismiss others or be overly stoic. And it's important to let people know that when we say, toxic masculinity, then we're not talking about, oh, if you feel this, you're bad. It's that men should be able to learn to understand these things and control them, so that they don't come out in unhealthy ways that I would describe as toxic masculinity.
And I think maybe part
Excellent
of that
suggestion.
is I don't know. I feel like there was a lot of talk about how to be a girl growing up, and very little, and in safe ways, like in good ways that were meant to protect me and protect me from those things that you just mentioned. And I think because it just seems to me that the conversation that people are having with boys about the idea of masculinity and how to be different types of men are just starting. Like, I feel like I benefited from a lot of it, and now we want to have those conversations with young boys, if we're in the classroom or if we're parenting or wherever we are, and not like you're a terrible person, right? Like, okay, let's talk about why that happened, and let's talk about what might be at play, and never about it being because you're a boy. That weird connection between biology and action.
I think we need to look at when this comes up, especially boy to boy. And a lot of times it's a lack of social skills. And so teaching our kids conflict resolution, how to listen, all that basic stuff is kind of getting lost. And I would like to see that, and I think it would replace a lot of this.
Yeah, and that I think impulse is right and good. Having taught in a public school, I know that that's often a controversial idea. My daughter goes to a Quaker school for that reason, because teaching conflict resolution is such an important part to me of education. But there seems to have become some strange connections between, not in my mind, but like as if you're brainwashing kids when you do that. Like, that's the line. I don't believe that, but that's kind of the school board line I hear. Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right, but I can see why public educators might be like, oh, I get it.
So for me, I recently over the last couple of years, I've been studying emotionally healthy spirituality, and this whole issue just really feels so close to what I have recently learned, which has been life-changing in a wonderful way for me. It's really about feelings.
Yep.
And about, first of all, when we've stuffed our feelings for so long, or we're told that we aren't allowed to have feelings, to even get to the point where we can figure out what they are is a huge challenge. And then to figure out how to discuss without, blowing up and having meltdowns and so forth. So this is, I think, really at the root of, to be our authentic selves, we need to get in touch with our feelings, right?
So I love that you said that, because just this morning in the New York Times, there's an opinion piece that is written by a male psychotherapist, and he talks about working with men since the Me Too movement and how men have changed the way they talk in their therapy sessions, and how he made a comment about, he'll ask his patient, well, how does that make you feel? And they'll say, it's frustrating. And how pointless that word is, right? But that these young adult men actually don't even have language at this point for the emotion they feel. They default to frustrating, and how he pushes them to actually not be ashamed of having an emotion. So you might, if you can, you should. I think that piece would very much speak to you, because as I read it this morning, I'm like, this is exactly what I'm talking about. But then by the time they get to their 20s, they don't even have names for their emotions anymore, because they've been wearing this mask. They've been forced to wear this mask for so long. So now you have to do this, like, all this unshedding work to realize that, no, I'm not a terrible person. I am allowed to feel feelings. I do not need to feel shame. These are all the opposite of this toxic masculinity path, right? If you think about like what a cow has to run through. You get one shot, one shoot, and if you don't go through that shoot, you can still be a man. You don't have to have your manhood questioned because you express regret, right? For example. It was on the New York Times opinion section this morning. I think it was something that was like working with men in the Me Too movement or something like that. It was all about what you just mentioned.
So that's great. So what I wanted to do is that is sort of, I want to open the floor now for 5 minutes for questions, anything else that maybe we didn't cover. You have a question about something. Hold on, I'm coming. I'm coming. Yeah, we talk till the food gets here. Okay.
As much time as you guys have.
Yeah. Speaking of language, a few years ago, this became a really popular term, and I remember the first time I heard it. I'm not a man, and I was horribly offended by it, and thank God it's starting to wane. Man up. Oh,
I didn't bring that one up, but that's really bad.
Yeah, I mean, every time I hear it, I think, what is that supposed to mean? And
grow
if
a
I was
pair.
A man, yeah, right,
grow a pair.
Right.
I classify.
Excellent example. Thank you. Yes. Yes.
Hi. I was just going to say, I really like how you explain how this is trying to let men out of that box. And I think it made me think of my husband. Now, we're together 20 years, and we're older, so he had a whole big life before me. And when I hear stories of his younger years, we'll get together with people who he hasn't seen in 30, 40 years or something, you run into somewhere, and they'll all be telling me about what a badass he was, and he did this, and do you remember when you put the principal in the cooler? Yes. And things like that. And I always look at him and I go, who is this person? I don't know this person they talk about. And now he was a Marine. He is still he's still very, honorable and protective and strong. They're all the qualities I like. I feel very, you know what I mean? But he said to me one day, and this just says it, he says, I don't have to be that person with you anymore. He said, you are so different than anybody I knew in my past. And when I met you, I didn't have to be that person. So it literally, it was a mask that he wore. Even little things like he hunted and did stuff that he doesn't like. He liked, he said, yeah, you ate the food. If you shot it, you ate it. And that's how I grew up, too. If you hunt and you shoot, you eat it. But he said, I hated killing animals, but I did it because all the other men did it. And he couldn't just say,
and
well, I don't want to shoot an animal.
He would have been mocked.
Yeah.
Right? And that's is that not only that, he had to opt in, but also opting out wasn't even an option.
Right.
For him.
So, not that, one way or another, you hunt or you don't hunt. If you hunt and you eat, that's your food. But he didn't have the fact that he can say now, no, I don't do it. And we actually just have 5 dogs, 3 cats, 4 goats, and 30-some chickens that we would never eat.
I'm coming to your house.
Just shows he can be who he wants to be now.
And what
That's incredible.
this
That's
conversation is about is to spare my 6-year-old nephew that experience, that it takes him until he's, I don't know how old your husband is now, but until he's at that point where he can feel that way, right? How do we spare children running through that gauntlet of masculinity when they don't want to? Oh, it's called What Men Say About #MeToo in Therapy by Avi Klein. It was published yesterday. That's the title. Thank you.
I wanted to ask to what extent, if any, I think you might have answered this, but I wasn't sure. To what extent, if any, do you think that biology does influence our behavior and tendencies? Because I do think that biology, to an extent, influences our behavior and our tendencies, but I found it difficult to balance that, basically saying that, I have a certain body and I'll have certain levels of, chemicals in my brain and the adrenaline and such. But at the same time, I don't want to try to prescribe a certain type of behavior to anyone as they grow up, but balancing those two things, basically.
So most of the research that's been done on gender and brains, or sex and brains, I should say, shows very small differences. So when we're talking about ability to have emotion or intelligence, a girl brain and a boy brain are very different. Of course, other parts of biology are very different. Hormones are very different.
Did you mean to say the same? You said that
what did I say?
Women in terms of having emotion or intelligence capability. The
Girl brains, boy. No, they're similar. Sorry. No. Girl brains and boy brains. I'm trying.
I know.
What's happening?
I know.
Is,
I heard there. I'm like, wait a minute.
Well,
no,
what's
I think
happening
you
is
meant-
in my
yeah.
brain, I'm trying to remember the
the-
woman's book. I know her name is Jill, and I'm like, oh, what's her name? But
yeah. No. Yeah. No,
I think the over belief that testosterone makes you be harsh or crude or violent is the problem, right? That testosterone is different. There's going to be a difference in maybe somebody who has a lot of testosterone who moves through the world. However, behavior is not prescribed by testosterone.
Well, it's back to what you said about impulses, right? And what we were talking about, the idea of having that urge or that language in the back of our heads when we, see a boy crying. You might want to think, in the back of your head, the phrase might be like, man up, but you don't want to say that, right? That's the urge, but you're going to be aware now and not say, even though the phrase, the idea, the action might come up, but you're going to restrain yourself. So in other words, if it was truly biological, you wouldn't be able to restrain yourself at all. I mean, if it truly were that simple, like you have a lot of testosterone, therefore you're violent, therefore it wouldn't even be possible to control it, right? But that's not the case for humans, right?
Right, there would be if that were true, there would be no space for change, and we should all just go home.
Yeah, not okay. Here, well, hold on, I'm coming.
But you would miss out on your pizza.
So I'm just having a thought about something you said. This is sounding like it could be a spectrum kind of disorder, if you will, how much you might be influenced by toxic masculinity. And I expect it applies to just about every male who's ever been, born.
My hope is that it's not.
To
at
some
point,
degree.
but,
I mean,
yeah.
we've all been exposed to it.
Sure.
I think that's what you're saying. But I just think it's a real hard sell when you mention the example of the incel individual who is more of a psychopath, I don't think.
But that is based in gender. That is a psychopathy, if that's a word, that is directly based in one's experience of gender.
Okay.
There's
I don't understand the movement so much, but I guess specifically when you made the example of an individual who hates women so much that there are, I hope, remote incidents where they actually include homicide. I'm saying that person doesn't even belong on this toxic masculinity
They're like the
scale.
hyper, exactly.
That is a psychopath.
That is the hyper. But here's the thing.
But it is on the spectrum.
So
it's
I don't
all
want
the
to
way
leave
on this side.
No. I want to talk
go
about
ahead.
this.
Go ahead.
Because I think this is super important. Because
We're
that
breathing.
is not all about mental health.
Right.
And this is the thing that is why I have started being on Fox News' radar, is because I am sick and tired of hearing the conversation that it's either mental health or what's the other side?
What, mental health?
When there's a shooting.
When there's
and gun control.
Oh, and
right?
gun control. So mental health or gun control.
So I am sick of this.
We're
mental
offering,
health, gun control. Mental health, gun control.
There's a third option.
So what
in the
I
middle,
did,
and it includes gender violence.
To your question, what I did is said, what if it's neither, and it has something to do with masculinity?
Yeah.
Because it's always men who are doing this, and you can name me the 3 anomalies. That's fine.
Yeah.
But for the most part, is there something else to this conversation? Because this conversation of mental health, gun reform has worked for none of us. Mm-hmm. It's not working. So that's when I started getting so interested in this topic. What is shared with these experiences?
So what are some of the cultural foundations? And that's not to say that all men, right? Not all men will become violent because you've been conditioned under this sort of toxic masculine agenda.
I'm not saying most or all, but what I am saying is
they do exist.
We cannot deny that there is a gendered element to some of these mass killings. That if you go back in their record, like the Gazette guy,
Capital Gazette.
He was stalking a woman.
Yeah.
If you go back to the guy in Canada, he was an out incel. If you go back to the shooting of the girls, remember all that years ago
In
Lancaster,
California.
the Amish girls.
Oh, the Amish girls.
That
Yeah,
was
yeah,
rooted
them
in
too.
misogyny. That there is a gendered element. That if we don't start, we can't. The circular mental health, and I agree, that dude is a psychopath.
Yeah.
I completely agree with
Definitely.
you. But I also want to point out, I think it's, if we don't acknowledge that there is a gendered component to that, is psychopathy a word? What is it? Psychopathy. If we don't talk about the gendered element of that psychopathy, then we're missing a part. And that's all I want us to do, is not miss that part.
Well, and
because
part
I
of the-
don't believe men do that because they have
Right.
penises.
No.
I
But
don't.
part
They're
of the
not doing
problem-
it because of biology.
And part of the problem with missing that part, right, is that if we miss that part, if we look past that part, if we reject that component, what we're doing is we're possibly missing an opportunity to solve the problem. Because, like as you pointed out, the whole mental health versus gun control, like that's a binary, right? And something I do a lot is rail against binaries. It's not about binaries. Our culture, our educational structure, our everything you see, it's everything you see in our world, it's about binaries. It's this or that. It's either or. And the thing is, that's not really how we live. It's not about binaries. It's not about mental health or gun control. There's more to it, and this is part of it. So you have to, as uncomfortable as it is, you have to embrace that and start talking about it as it's part of the problem so that we can try to reverse it. But again, it's very uncomfortable, right, for us because we've all grown up with those attitudes. And to say, well, that's part of it is like, oh my God, I'm not like him. Right. Thank you for not being, that's good. But it is part of it, right? So I think we're going to have one final, you're going to be our last one. Okay, she's going to add something. I think is the pizza here?
So, yeah, I wanted to add something because I'm in a very unique position to answer that question. Oddly enough, I just returned the week before last from Toronto for the Canadian Writers' Summit, where we had a panel to discuss incel attacks and masculinity in the classroom. And I think one of the main problems that we had is absolutely somebody who takes action and murders other people or injures or does anything, out in the world to physically harm other people is a psycho. Like, they are taking just extra steps. They have a mental problem. But the true and I think more profound issue that we need to deal with on a daily basis within our classrooms and within our society is the fact that there are young men who fall victim to this mentality due to isolation and this toxic masculinity, who support that person, who say, I'm not brave enough to do anything like that, but good on him, good for him, great, And that's where our stance as people, as teachers, as mothers and aunts and uncles and grandparents, is to be able to, when we have the power, identify those at-risk youth, the young men who are so isolated and are so angry and are stifled by their ability to express that by toxic masculinity, those people who may very well do have mental health problems, but because they are boys are told they are not to go seek help for it. Those, are the points where we can intervene and we can stop these major attacks, as well as just that smaller mentality of, yeah, he did a good thing. And the pain within those young men that they're living with every day, with that idea, because how much pain did that person have to have in the first place to go out and make that attack? And these young men are not doing that, but they're still living with that same pain.
So as we sort of have referenced as we've gone, nothing exists in a vacuum, right? All of these things are connected. So we want to live in a binary world. We want to make it so that it's easy to fix, it's easy to understand. We can solve this if we just do X. But the reality is all of these things are connected. Toxic masculinity is all part of it. And so this is a piece of the conversation where maybe we're not going to fix the big problems. We're not going to solve the problems of incels and the violence that they commit. We're not going to solve all of it. But if we start talking about it differently, if we start making those little activist moves in our own lives, within our own social circles, that actually is enough. I would argue to you that that's enough. And anything that you do beyond that, it's gravy, and that's great. But not everybody can commit to going to a rally or, calling their congressional representative every day or, working with, troubled youth. But we can all have a conversation. We can all post a story on social media and start a conversation. We can all start using different language. We can all think in our own heads when that language comes up, man up, grow a pair, boys will be boys. Just don't say it, and maybe ask other people not to, too.
And I'm really grateful that you were here and that you were part of this conversation. It's a conversation we care very much about. This is just the tip of the conversation. We have lots of episodes about this on our podcast that is free. There's a whole one about toxic masculinity. There's one about incels. We try to talk about gender in ways. Incels? Oh. So this is also the beginning of a conversation, right? This isn't the end. And if you want more, you should have gotten a postcard and a sticker, and if you didn't, we'll get you a sticker.
Yeah, you can reach out to us, and
yep.
Thank you very much for your attention and
today.
for coming out today. Thank you.
So thank you for, I think I have it back on, we're good. Thank you so much for running mics. I got the week off from running mics. This was fantastic. This was really great, and I want to thank Paula, who invited our guests today to come and talk, and the timing couldn't have worked out better. Thank you, Paula. She also represented humanism at Tuesdays with Toomey a couple weeks ago and did a bang-up job doing that. So I'm really appreciative of that, and I just wanted to mention it. In the back room there, if you're dining with us today, if you brought food or if you placed an order, bring a chair back there in the back. And even if you're not dining with us today, walk around in the back. There's an art installation right now that talks about defying gender norms. It's called Girls Will Be, Boys Will Be, Girls Will Be, ... And there's one little, it's like a coloring book, right? And there's one on the back corner there that says, it's a father and son. You would assume it's a father and son cleaning up the house, wearing the aprons. They've got the mop and the whole thing. And one of them says to the other, hey, after we're done cleaning up the house, let's go dismantle toxic masculinity. So I don't think the timing could have worked out any better. So please do check that out. Yeah, so thank you again for coming. And as soon as we get August's program figured out, we will blast it out there on social media, Meetup, our newsletter. And in the meantime, just check out our website, lvhumanists.org. Thank you so much.